Hello and welcome to another episode of Laptop Retrospective, and today we are taking a look at the ThinkPad X201. Now, just a little bit of background information because the X200 and the X201 have an awful lot in common, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. So consider this in terms of like the hardware, primarily very comparable. The main difference between the 200 and 201 is, and correct me if I'm wrong, was a processor update. So, for example, in the 2008 version, these units usually had a Core 2 Duo, whereas these refreshes, which happened 2 years later in 2010, contain the i5 and i, etc. series of processors. In fact, this one only came in like two larger groups, so you could either get it in an i5, and there was, I think, 4 different options for the i5, and then of course there was an i7 option as well. Standard Intel integrated graphics. This was capable of up to 8 gigabytes of RAM, PC3 8500 or PC3 10600 was the memory standards that went into these fellows, and the display was actually a relatively decent 1280 by 800. That was kind of the hardware specs. Now, this was very much the beginnings of some of the more loved X series computers. There are a couple of features on this one that, of course, that would not make the trip to future versions, and I do have my X220 off screen to do a little bit of comparison. But if we actually take a look at the two units, they look very, very similar indeed. So this one does not have the Lenovo branding on this corner, but the ThinkPad logo is in the right place. The top chassis is almost the same, not interchangeable, and you can also tell from the hinge size that they definitely beefed that up. More indicator lights over here, less over here. You could also see that there is a space or a slot cut out here for something, but I'm not entirely sure what that is. If anyone knows, please post in the comments. I'd be really curious. So we're going to put the 220 off to the side for a moment, and we're going to take a look at a couple of features unique to this machine. The very first is it actually has a latch. So this is not something that you would see in any future version of the X series, which makes this, I think, relatively unique. I know that they had it prior to, but not since then. We do have these serrations up here, which are very cosmetic, right next to your webcam or your Think Light and all of that other good stuff. We've also got an array of different indicator lights on the inside of the chassis as well, and you can actually see that there are some pretty distinct changes here with regards to the display and the casing. We can see that both machines are rocking the more classic style keyboard, but this one has, it feels like certainly more defined keys in a couple of different places. They're not one-to-one, and from what I can tell, you can't really swap them. We'll see what happens when we remove it, because this piece up here, of course, would need to fit this cutout up here, and I'm not 100% sure about that. Trackpads, no, they're probably not swappable either, not directly anyway. They look just a little bit too different. As you can see, these serrations are gone on the next model. They don't bother to tell you that this is a web camera. They expect you to figure that out. Little things like that. The button configuration essentially remains the same. They just decided to move them around, play with them. This one is given, these two are given indicator lights, but not on the X201. It is worth pointing out that there is no official X210, so the X220 is actually a good comparison for the next model up. This one does come with the optional fingerprint reader built in, which is a nice addition, although this is a very claustrophobic layout for that, and I kind of realized that having this machine in front of me. So let's continue our tour. On the left-hand side of this particular unit, we have USB 2.0. We actually have a split headphone and microphone jack. You don't see this often anymore. Most days it's combo. We do have a 56K modem, which kind of shows the era that this machine is coming from. This is the access bay to the hard disk. We also have our Kensington lock, and you can tell this Kensington lock got some use. On the back, we have absolutely nothing. On the left-hand side, we have our charging barrel plug, and this would actually be a change. They would move this to the back of the unit on the X220. We have our CPU vent. We have another USB 2.0. We also have our VGA port, and you'll notice that there is no second option for display because at that time it's VGA and VGA. You have network, express card, USB 2.0 always on, and a much larger Wi-Fi on and off toggle switch. If we take a look at the X220, they actually shrunk the size of that switch down, even though it wasn't really taking up any massive real estate, but it probably allowed them to add some strengthening to the bottom chassis, and of course the display port was added. So before we actually begin, just a quick field strip of this laptop. This is actually probably a good time to tell a little bit of history behind this unit. And that means story time. And you know what that means. And honestly, I thought I would never get to use that video clip again. It was sold to a client of my colleague, and it was lost. They actually left it at an airport. The laptop was found by airport personnel. It was identified who the original owner was, and it was sent back to the original owner in an unpadded envelope. And shockingly, if I remember the story correctly, the only pieces that were actually replaced was the bottom case. And this bottom case is actually a donor case from the X200, which just goes to show the very little difference in body panels between these two particular units. So kind of a cool story that I don't really think anything else had to be really addressed beyond some damage to this bottom panel. So let's go ahead and start disassembly. I'm going to first off find my favorite ThinkPad screwdriver, also known as the Phillips. All right, first thing we're going to do is remove the battery. This catch has seen some better days, but that's okay. It still comes out. These batteries, as far as I know, are cross-compatible to the X200 and X201. So any battery will do. They came in 6 and 9 cells. That is a rebuild, obviously. That's not an original Lenovo battery. We do have our docking connector here, and we've got a whole lot of nothing right back here. This would be the SIM card, what would appear to be a SIM card tray if that was an available option. So let's go ahead and remove our RAM access panel. This is already looking very, very similar again to the X220. So I expect to see both RAM slots facing me, and that's exactly what I've got. So let's take a quick peek-see and see what this particular unit is running for RAM. So we have one 2 gig module there of Samsung, and over here, this one looks a little different, is a 1 gig module. So we've got 3 gigs of RAM in this, and it can take up to 8. So definitely a lot of room to expand for the future owner of this machine. Next thing we'll do is the hard drive removal, which is this big screw here. There we go. And that screw is not retained, I guess. Flip out our tab, and that is a slightly thicker cradle than what I was expecting to see. That is not... Well, maybe it is. These buffers just look enormous in comparison to the X220, so I'm not 100% sure if that is a part that you would be able to use in that series of laptops as well. All right, let's keep going here. So we got some keyboard removal screws clearly labeled. So that's for the palm rest and the keyboard. Palm rest and keyboard. And I think the rest are palm rest. Oh, there's one more for palm rest and keyboard. So let's just make sure we're keeping things nice and neat here. So we'll undo all the palm rest and keyboard screws, because that'll give us access to really all the stuff that we would want to see. There's another palm rest and keyboard screw. And there's another palm rest and keyboard screw under the battery area. Got one over here. I have to say, this chassis feels a lot nicer than the X220. I don't know if they changed like plastics or a manufacturer process, but I am noting that it feels like a much nicer build quality. I'm not, like I said, I'm not too sure what attributes to that, but it just feels a lot tankier. I think it might be thicker. Okay, that should be all the screws for trackpad and keyboard. So let's see if they take apart the same way. So first things first, we'll do our patent ThinkPad keyboard wiggle, and that easily came free. So we'll lift that up from the bottom, flip that forward, and there's our pull tab to release. That couldn't have been easier. The cable design is definitely a little different, so I'm not so sure if you'd be swapping these between any other models. So we'll just put that off to the side. And wow, it looks really simple under here. I don't know what I was expecting though. So our ribbon cable to our display is very easily accessible. It's hanging out right there. So that is kind of a newer feature, or older feature I should say. We can see the power supply going from the barrel plug very easily. Our fan is right there, but of course that's attached to the heat sink on the other side. There's our CMOS battery, and it looks like we'll have to remove this to get to it. So let's apply some gentle persuasion to these side pieces. And that lifts right off. And this was barely being held in there. Me prying up did all the work. And on the bottom, of course, we have the fingerprint module right there. And I don't know, this just looks very thrown together in a lot of ways. Like there are a couple of screws, but it's all like screw, metal plate, screw, metal plate. But hey, that's still a relatively thin profile for the very simple but effective techniques they're using to manufacture that. I think, unless I'm wrong, this might actually be part of the drain mechanism, because you can tell that water is going to be channeled through here. This is all what appears to be some kind of silk screen or protection that would drain out here, and there's also a drain hole here. So our CMOS battery is there, it's taped into place, very easy to remove. Over here is our Wi-Fi card, and that's pretty simple. We do have a ribbon cable that's being bent off at quite an interesting angle here. I'm going to zoom in on this. That's an interesting manufacture technique. Let's go ahead and flip that up and move that out of the way. So that's being bent over and running this way, so it's actually the ribbon cable that's connecting your SD card reader, which I didn't mention, as well as USB audio, and your 56K modem is hanging out over here as well. And there is your information on that. If you needed an information card on a 56K modem, there's where you find it. It also looks like there is additional room for another card hanging out over here. So like a WWAN card. That bay, I am curious to know if you really wanted to, could you dump in anything else? So just doing some quick reading, it doesn't look like you would be able to like drop in any kind of MSATA drive in here. If you know anything to the contrary of what this slot could expand for, please feel free to leave that below in the comments. I would be very curious to know. The only other thing that I will point out that I'm noticing is we have a speaker. And it's this module that just actually lifts straight up and out. That's it. Other than that, like everything is very easily accessible, lots of screws, but anything that you would really need to service with the exception of the main board is going to be very easy to remove. And even then, there's not really much in the way of the main board. So let's go ahead and reassemble this thing and make any last minute comments. So ladies and gentlemen, I went and grabbed my X220 hard disk caddy, if you will, and they are a different size from the 201. The 201 is thicker, and then the chassis has a different ride height in its little bracket there. So the two, as far as I can tell, are not interchangeable. So just wrapping up a couple of things. This particular unit's been installed with Windows 10, and it's not exactly what I would call peppy. I think that if you were looking to still use an X201 at this day and age, that you either would need to temper your expectations accordingly or realistically throw a good Linux distribution on it, like Elementary OS or Linux Mint, depending on your flavor. But again, Windows 10 is starting to show its age, although the fingerprint reader is supported by Windows Hello, which is a nice little plus. But even in using it in some very simple applications, there is a delay that in the year 2018 would probably not be acceptable for the great majority of users. That being said though, if you're looking for like an enthusiast machine to add to your collection, or like I said, you want to dabble in Linux but have a very low entry rate, this to me would be an excellent machine to do it, because you still have a Core i series, so it's not that dated. The hardware is going to be readily supported. In terms of what you're able to modify, we're not having locked down BIOSes yet in this version, of course. That wouldn't come until the X230. There is still a lot to like. With the 6-cell aftermarket battery, we're going to get about 3 to maybe 4 hours of performance, give or take, on the most conservative battery setting. Oh, that jumped up to 4 hours now. But that being said, it is a nice piece of history. But I think going back this far, we need to start looking at these things through the lens of antiquity and what was, rather than what can still currently be used. If you enjoy this sort of content, then I would and please encourage you to like the video, subscribe, hit that notification bell if you do want to see what's going to be coming up next. It's people like you that allow me to, get to show you stuff like this. If there wasn't an interest, I wouldn't show it, and it's quite clear to me that there is an interest, especially for some of these ThinkPad units on the channel. In fact, you could say that there might be more ThinkPads coming in the near future. So once again, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.